Good evening and welcome to this special conversations program presented by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library. My name is Erin Dumeier. I'm director of the library. In a moment, I'm going to let our host introduce tonight's special guest, but first I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you and to tell you a little bit about the award-winning Conversations series. Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy is a series of lectures and events led by the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. Winner of the 2022 Connecticut Library Association's Award for Excellence in Public Library Service, this series began in the fall of 2019 to continue the community conversation on issues of race, justice, and democracy. A quick thank you to our media sponsor, WSHU, as well as area libraries and leagues for their support of this series, including the League of Women Voters of Weston, Richfield, and Northern Fairfield County, and the public libraries of Easton, Weston, Richfield, and the C.H. Booth Library in Newtown. And now just a few notes of housekeeping on how to participate in tonight's program. We are recording tonight's program, so it'll be available to view next week on the library's YouTube channel in case you have friends or family who couldn't make it this evening. We've set aside time for questions at the end of the program. You're welcome to submit these questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're also offering closed captioning, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. One last note, our very special guest this evening, the author David Zucchino, has graciously signed a few book plates to go with this Pulitzer Prize winning history. The signed book plates will be available with the purchase of a copy of Wilmingtons Lie at both Books on the Common in Richfield and Bird Books in Bethel. There's a limited number of book plates at both stores, so please be sure to pick up your copy soon. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our conversation host for this evening, who will lead tonight's discussion with author David Zucchino. Dr. Daniel W. Barrett. You work hard for those doctors. We got to remember to use that title, right? Dr. Barrett is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University and a member of the Conversations Committee. A resident of Reading, he graduated with a BA from Wesleyan University, earned his PhD in social psychology from Arizona State University, and served as a postdoctoral research fellow in health communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Barrett. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another event in our series of conversations on truth and democracy. I want to first thank the Mark Twain Library for sponsoring this event, as well as the Reading League of Women Voters. And I am a proud board member of that group for helping to organize tonight's events. So tonight, as you know, we have Pulitzer Prize winning author and correspondent David Zucchino as our conversations guest. David is currently a contributing writer for the New York Times. In addition to being awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his 1989 series called Being Black in South Africa, he's been a finalist for the award 4 times. As a longtime war correspondent, David has been stationed in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, Kenya, Iraq, and dozens of other countries. He's also written books on the US attack on Baghdad and on the myth of the welfare queen. Tonight, we're going to focus on this book called Wilmingtons Lie, the Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. To members of the audience who have not yet read this book, I heartily recommend it. It's clearly written, it's well documented. It's what I would call a version of deep American history. And what I mean by that is that he takes an event that most of us have never heard of and goes into this in tremendous depth to bring out, to shed light on these deep caverns of American history and really bring truths to the fore that we never would have noticed or heard about otherwise. So it's a very deep dive in history in that sense. It's not a fun book by any means, but it reads like a novel. It's compelling and provides us with important insights into our own sort of history in the United States or parts of that history. This book touches on all three of our components of our conversations series, truth, myth, and democracy. In the case of Wilmington, there were lies and myths that led up to the coup and massacre. The truths about those events were covered up for maybe 100 years or so, and only are now, and in recent decades, being brought to the light. And lastly, the events themselves overthrew and dismantled a democratically elected government, but also had repercussions for local democracy and government for decades to come, possibly even to the present day. We'll ask David about that in a little bit. So David, you and your work are perfect for our series, and I look forward to chatting with you tonight. So I have a bunch of questions to get us going, and then after about an hour or so, we'll turn to audience questions, and then we'll go from there and wrap up around 9 o'clock. So let me start by the first question. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book? What was the first bit of information that tipped you off that it was an important and largely unknown story to be told? And then relatedly, at what point or how far into your early investigation made you decide to write a whole book about this? Was that an easy decision? Was it a difficult one to commit your life, several years of your life to writing such an intensely rich book?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. And just before I answer the question, thank you to everybody listening in. I hope you find this a little bit edifying. I think Dan's going to be a great host, and we've communicated a little bit. In answer to your first question, I'm always embarrassed to admit that I went to high school and college in North Carolina, yet I had never heard of this event. I mean, no professor ever mentioned it, no teacher, no student. It wasn't in any of our readings. I really didn't know anything about it until 1998, when the Centurion, the 100-year anniversary in Wilmington was marked, and I read newspaper coverage about it, and I was shocked that I could be so ignorant about such a pivotal event in American history, and I was shocked that something like this could actually happen in the United States. I wasn't sure it was true, and then the more I looked into it, the more fascinated and intrigued I became, and there was just not much written about it. There had been many academic papers, but in the public consciousness, it just hadn't sunk in. And as I say, I didn't even know about it. And it just took me a while to decide whether it was worthy of a deep dive and a book, and also just to find time to do it. At that time, I was really overseas most of the time. And just in the last few years, I finally found the time and found a publisher who was interested in what seemed to be an obscure point in American history, but which, as we looked into it, seemed more and more important and more relevant when we looked at what was happening in race and politics today. So that's how it came about.
Well, thanks. So how long did it take you to write the book? I mean, people see a book like this with the exacting detail, and you clearly spent a lot of time in archives, you interviewed people, you read newspaper articles, probably other books, other documents, etc. So how long did it take to write the book, and how hard was it to find a publisher for this book?
The research took a while, much longer than the writing. This was different. My two previous books were about events that I witnessed, that I took part in, where I could interview people. And of course, this is a historical event and everybody's long dead. So every fact and every line in that book comes from a piece of paper somewhere, from a document. So I spent a lot of time in libraries and reading through newspaper coverage, reading journals and diaries. There's just so much available, but it's scattered in various libraries in various places. So it was a real hunt on the internet and through pieces of paper in archives. But it took probably a year and a half or so of research before I finally really got a handle on it, and probably another 6 to 7 months to write it while I continued the research. And it was difficult writing about something that happened so long ago. It was very frustrating. I just wanted to really be able to grab somebody and say, what was it like? What were you thinking? But the fact that so many of the white supremacists who plotted and carried this thing out were so proud of it and bragged about it later and wrote memoirs and letters and telegrams, there was quite a bit about their motivation and their thinking and their reasoning. And that's what really fascinated me the most, is how could this come about? How could people pull this together? And what were they after? And what were their motivations? And a lot of that came through in their journals and letters and diaries. I think they revealed a lot more than they intended to. Now on the Black side, it was much more difficult because, as you can imagine, people were running for their lives. the black newspaper, the daily paper, had been burned to the ground and all the archives destroyed. So there wasn't that written record that there was on the white side. One valuable resource was black newspapers in other towns in the South, which these towns would receive black people and black families fleeing from Wilmington, within days of the coup. And so you had real-time, fresh accounts and interviews of these people. And so that was invaluable. And there were black leaders, lawyers and ministers and others who wrote memoirs and wrote publications in the black press detailing their experiences in the right and talking about other people's experiences. So with that, I was able to get a pretty good picture of the black side of things.
So can you draw us a picture of the governance of Wilmington before all this happened? So, and how integrated in the government, in public service, in business were African Americans prior to these events? I think you quote somebody in your prologue that Wilmington may have been the freest city in the country for African Americans. And then you also state that, and perhaps it was the most integrated city in the South at that time. So just tell us what things were like before all these events started to unfold.
Yeah, Wilmington was really an outlier. It was a very unique city among Southern cities at that time. First of all, it had a majority black population, which was extremely rare in major cities. And Wilmington was a major city. It was the biggest city in North Carolina, more than 20,000 people, which was a pretty good sized city at that time. And it had a major port. In fact, it was the last Confederate port to fall during the war. In 1865, and actually for the last year of the war, the port kept the Confederacy alive until it fell. Black formerly enslaved people had really migrated to Wilmington because there were so many jobs there in the railroads and in the pitch, tar, and turpentine industry and the cotton industry. And it really blossomed and it developed into a very strong and thriving middle class, Black middle class in Wilmington, as well as a professional class of doctors, lawyers, professors, teachers, funeral home directors. On the political side, it was very interesting. I don't think there was another city in the South that had so many Black men in civic life, public life, elected and appointed office. 10 of the 26 policemen were Black men. 3 of the 10 city councilmen or aldermen were Black men. The postmaster, the street superintendent, the coroner, the jailer, all these were Black men. There were Black magistrates, which really infuriated the white supremacists because some of them actually had to appear before a Black magistrate. Black men, as I said, had earned electoral office through the power of the Black vote, and then they had been appointed to some of these offices. And this came about, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but a process called fusion, in which poor whites who had been loyal to the Populist Party drifted away after a recession in the early 1890s and joined forces unwillingly with Black voters and Republicans to throw out the white supremacist Democrats who had been controlling the state legislature. In 1896, the so-called fusionists took over the state legislature. 1897, they took over the city government in Wilmington. And of course, this infuriated the white supremacists who had been in power for generations. So overall, Wilmington was quite unique in the depth and the extent of Black men participating in government in both elected and appointed office.
So aside from the 1896 election that you just talked about, what were some of the other key events leading up to the massacre and to the coup? I mean, I know you can't recite the entire book, because you wrote a whole book about this, but just if you could give listeners who haven't maybe read the book, just a few of the key things that happened before, November 10th, 1898, and who were the actors behind them and so forth.
Yeah, this has actually been building really since the end of the Civil War. White supremacists were defeated, but they were unbowed. They were as determined as ever to keep Black men, quote, in their place, which was a term that was used. And they very much resented, well, first of all, losing the Civil War, but Reconstruction was very painful and damaging to white supremacists. When black men were voting, black men were in public office and appointed office. And it was only until after Reconstruction that the white supremacists could garner enough power through the KKK and vigilantes to really make a mark and start threatening Black advancement. And this was building and building and building until fusion and until Black men started participating directly in government in Wilmington in the mid 1890s. So early in 1898, the state leadership of the white supremacists, who openly called themselves actually white supremacists, they did not hide it. There was a newspaper editor named Josephus Daniels. He edited and published the News and Observer in Raleigh, which was the largest and most influential newspaper in the state. And he met with a wonderfully named man named Furnifold Simmons, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party. And they started plotting a takeover of the government in Wilmington in the fall of 1898. Tied to the midterm elections, which were on November 8th, 1898. And throughout the summer, they laid a plan, a very careful, orchestrated plan using vigilantes, terror, suppression, and disinformation in newspapers, misinformation and lies to incite whites to attack Black men and to rob them of the vote and rob them of their role in civic life. And they were remarkably successful. And we can talk about how successful they were in a little while, but that was the scene leading up to November 10th, 1898.
So you mentioned myths and lies. Today we talk about fake news all the time and the rumors that are out there on the internet and conspiracy theories that are totally unfounded and so forth, as if this is a new thing, but it's not a new thing. No. We've had rumors and conspiracy theories for millennia, and wherever there have been people, there have been lies and myths and conspiracy theories and so forth. So, and at this time, I know there were a lot of those going around, things about, Blacks were arming themselves, preparing for war, or planning to start a war, or a so-called race riot, a term that I really despise. But of course, these rumors actually led to or fed the actual violence, caused the violence they were trying to predict or trying to assume was going to happen. Now, there were accusations of corruption. There's promulgation of ridiculous and awful stereotypes of African Americans, lots of fear mongering. So can you talk a little bit about some of those things? So the soft elements of what happened behind the scenes, or actually not even behind the scenes, it was actually very much out in the open, as were these claims for white supremacists.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, there was a very calculated and careful misinformation campaign mounted by the newspapers, led by the News and Observer in Raleigh, but also other papers around the state, particularly in Wilmington, which had 3 or at least 4 white supremacist newspapers. Then you had the News and Observer and other papers, and they collaborated on portraying Black men, first of all, as ignorant and unintelligent and not smart enough to be allowed to vote, but also corrupt and incompetent and unable really to carry out the duties in government. And they just pounded on this theme throughout the summer. And the other theme they pounded on was a term they used was the Black beast rapist. And they kept publishing phony stories alleging that there was an epidemic of rapes of white women by Black men, which was not true at all. There was no epidemic at all. But the newspapers portrayed Black men as insatiable and just focused on attacking white women. And of course, this incited white men to violence with just this allegation that their women were under attack by these insatiable Black men. So those 2 themes were really played up in the white newspapers throughout the summer and the fall, leading up until the coup. Politically, the white supremacists had a whole speakers bureau. They would send speakers out onto the stump to incite white voters, first of all, to turn them away from the populists and the fusionists, and to get them to vote for return back to the Democratic fold, but also again to spread these lies and myths about Black men being unqualified for office and being rapists and chasing after white women. And so this just built up until November 10th, when the incitement really peaked, as was planned. I mean, they laid this all out by the date, and we can talk about that in a little while. But this was really the disinformation and fake news campaign, which was very effective, even with no social media, no radio, and no TV, just through the newspapers and through these white supremacist politicians on the stump. The message really resonated. I should mention also one really interesting tack that Josephus Daniels took at the News and Observer. He realized that almost 25% of the white electorate was illiterate in 1898, but he found a way to reach those men with, he hired a political cartoonist. And this cartoonist would draw Black men as monsters and thugs and vultures. One cartoon literally showed a Black man as a vulture with his claws reaching out, chasing fleeing white women. So that was just incredibly effective. This whole series of cartoons just demonizing Black men over and over again, which again was really led to violence and incitement and violence on behalf of white men against Black men.
Yeah, we've seen those rumors and these stereotypes spread. They're actually all over the country at this point. It didn't just happen here in Wilmington. Now you can look forward to 1915 in the movie Birth of a Nation, which was shown in the Woodrow Wilson White House, and that had some of those same kinds of characteristics or caricatures as part of that. And that was unfortunately hugely influential in bringing the KKK back to life after it kind of been dormant, in prior decades. And we still see some of those stereotypes today, which we'll maybe talk about later on in the conversation if we have time for it. So one could we talk about are the red shirts. There's a red shirt militia. And can you talk a little bit about who they were and if you know where that name came from and what their role was in all these events?
Yeah, the red shirts were really an outgrowth of the KKK. Now, in Wilmington in 1868, the KKK had actually been driven out of the city by a Black militia armed with clubs and fence posts. It actually drove them out. And then during this white supremacy campaign, which is the term that the white supremacists used in 1898, the red shirts arose, and these were basically the sons and nephews of Klan members. It was essentially the Klan, but they called them the red shirts. They wore red shirts. I saw a lot of different explanations for why they were called red shirts and why they wore red shirts. The most plausible were most of these white supremacists were Scots-Irish immigrants or sons and grandsons of immigrants, and the red supposedly represented the blood of slain Highlanders. I don't know if that's true or not, but they did wear these red shirts, and they were basically the private militia of the white supremacy movement. But the white supremacy movement also had two state militias completely under their control. There was the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Wilmington Naval Reserves. Now, these were basically the National Guard of the day, and they reported supposedly to the Republican governor in Raleigh. But in actuality, they were commanded, each one was commanded by one of the leaders of the white supremacy movement in Wilmington, and they were completely made up of white supremacists and controlled by the leadership of the white supremacist movement. During the summer, because whites were outnumbered by Blacks, the city's white supremacist businessmen raised money to buy rapid fire machine guns for both of these militias to outfit them, because they were worried they wouldn't be able to control the Black population. What was interesting, you mentioned earlier the disinformation, and one of the biggest pieces of fake news that was really spread by the newspapers during that summer was that Black residents, Black men in Wilmington were plotting a race riot and a coup, and that they were stockpiling weapons and ammunition and were planning on election day to rise up, kill all the white men and rape all the white women and take over the city, which was a complete fabrication, was completely false. First of all, Black men had very few weapons. All of the hardware stores, the gun dealers, were run by white supremacists, and they refused to sell to Black men. but they sold hundreds and hundreds of weapons and mountains of ammunition during the summer to white supremacists. And in fact, the city's stores ran out of weapons and ammunition, and they had to telegraph north to Baltimore and Richmond and have more weapons and more ammunition sent down by train. So Wilmington on the white side was really an armed camp where just about every white male, and including a lot of kids, were armed with multiple weapons. There was, at least one weapon for every white woman and man and child in Wilmington. And on the other hand, as I said, the black men had very few weapons. So it was really a one-sided fight. But if you read the newspapers, you would think that there was this army of black men armed and ready to take over the city.
So what happened on, let's say from November 9th through 10th, the 11th, the election was on 10th. So what happened on the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th? That was really the key. It was the key days, right, of what's happened here. There's a lot of build up for, several decades of civil war. More recently than that, the rumors and the fear mongering and the gun collecting and so forth up until November. What happened the day before the election? And then on the election, next couple of days, that was really, the heart of what happened, of the massacre, of the tragedy of Wilmington.
Right. The day before the election, there was a mass meeting of white men at Thalian Hall, which was the seat of government in a theater in downtown Wilmington. And there was probably 1,000 white men there cheering and chanting. The leader and the speaker of the crowd that night was Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer who was the leading speaker on the stump. He was a very Trumpian figure. Was very bellicose, very argumentative, but was really an effective speaker, a very florid speaker, very powerful. And he just had this audience enraptured that night. And he was telling them that, during the election the next day, they were to go out and prevent any black man from voting. And during the summer, they had prepared for this by sending the red shirts out into the Cape Fear countryside during the summer. They would break into black homes, yank out black men, beat them, and then threaten them with death if they dared register to vote. And at the same time, all the white employers who employed black workers would check with their black workers, and if they found out they had registered to vote, they would fire them. So this was extremely effective in tamping down the vote. And this was really the focus of this meeting the night before the election, was to plan for a scheme that was in place to steal the election. And they did steal the election through intimidation and fraud. And I just want to read from Colonel Waddell from his speech that night, just a couple of quotes. You can just see the mindset. Again, this is Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell speaking to about 1,000 white men, many of them red shirts, the night before the election. Men, the crisis is upon us. You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You have the courage. You are brave. You are the sons of noble ancestry. You are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Be ready at a moment's notice. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. So you can just see how whipped up the crowd was the night before the election and ready to go out into the streets the next day. And the next day, the red shirts did go in the street and confront, intimidate, threaten black men, and really cut the black vote, and at the same time barged into polling places, would create a diversion by knocking over a lamp and creating a small fire, and literally stuffed ballot boxes with fake Democratic votes and pulled out Republican votes. In some precincts, there were more Democratic votes than there were registered voters in the district. So it was an out and out fraud. The Democrats did win the election, not only in Wilmington, but took over the state legislature, basically through terror, fraud, and intimidation.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn our attention then to Alex Manley, who's one of the more prominent and important persons in Wilmington prior to all these events happening. I know he's a journalist and columnist. And tell us about what he was doing in Wilmington, what his role was, and not in the events themselves. He wasn't obviously involved in those, but he wrote a column that was somewhat incendiary in response to other columns and comments from before that. And so what did he say? Why did he say it? What were the implications and effects of what he said?
Yeah, Alex Manley was a fascinating character. He was the grandson of a white governor of North Carolina. So he was mixed race. Many people told him he could pass as white and encouraged him to live his life as a white man, but he refused, and he identified as a black man and lived his life as a proud black man. He started the Daily Record, which he claimed was the only black newspaper in the country. I don't believe it was, but it was one of very few. It was a black daily. And this newspaper was actually popular among whites as well. White advertisers advertised in the paper, but Manley, as the white supremacy campaign got bolder and bolder during the summer and more obvious in what they were planning, he started fighting back in print. And in August of 1898, he responded to a speech that was given in Georgia by a woman named Rebecca Felton, who was the wife of a white supremacist congressman in Georgia. She gave a speech upbraiding the white men of Georgia for what she said was their failure to punish black men for what she said was a rape epidemic. And again, there was no rape epidemic in Georgia, but she said there was. She provided in this speech a lot of phony numbers about supposed rapes of white women, and said that the only solution for this epidemic was, quote, the lynch rope. And part of her speech that everybody remembered was, she said, "I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary." So this enraged Alex Manley when he finally read it, and he wrote an editorial in response, in which essentially he made 2 points. One was that many, if not most, of the black men lynched for allegedly raping white women were in fact their consensual lovers. Secondly, he pointed out what everybody knew was true, but nobody talked about, is that for generations, white men had been raping black women, particularly enslaved black women, with impunity for many years. And nobody ever talked about either of those subjects, and he put it in print. And the effect was incendiary. The red shirts started marching and wanted to lynch Manley that day and burn down his newspaper. And to show you how premeditated this coup was, the leaders of the white supremacy campaign said, no, it's too early. We want to use this event, this editorial, to incite whites later on in the fall, and we want to use it as an issue in the election campaign. So they prevented Alex Manley's lynching. They kept the paper going. They actually reprinted hundreds and thousands of copies and spread it around North Carolina and around the South, just to further incite white men against black voters. And Alex Manley survived through the summer and continued publishing columns confronting the white supremacists and essentially demanding the rights that were guaranteed to black men under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And this all came to a head just before the coup, when Manley was warned by a white man. Well, I'm not sure who it was, nobody knows who it was, but somebody in the white supremacy movement warned him that he was about to be lynched, and gave him $25 in gold coin and told him he really needed to leave town. And Alex got in a buggy, dressed in a suit, and made it through the red shirt checkpoints that had been set up around town, because he had been given the password needed to get through, and he used the password. And because he appeared to be a white man, he was able to talk his way through, and he escaped just a few days before the coup. Eventually ended up in Wilmington, never ever returned to Wilmington again.
Yeah, so one of the ironic or tragic ironies here is that here we have this man, Alex Manley, who tells us truth, right? He speaks the truth. And the truth is what set off so many people, because they didn't want to believe it. They couldn't believe it. They couldn't accept it. And so, you know, the lies, everybody loved the lies, but somebody speaks the truth. Not only does he speak the truth, but then it gets, as you just said, published all over the place and printed and reprinted. And that's what set people off, to not being able to understand the truth or handle the truth that's right in front of their eyes, that they should have known all along anyway. So speaking more about the press, in your book, you talk about how some of the newspapers around the country responded to the events on November 10th and so forth. You talked about the New York Times and Washington Post and some other newspapers, and some were sadly, tragically, I don't know what the word, misinformed is to maybe to be nice about it, but
Right, yeah.
like just promulgating these lies. And so tell us about some of those responses in the newspapers. And I think there were one or two that actually were on the sort of right side of the story. If you could talk about that as well, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, that because the white supremacists had been so open about what they were planning during the summer. This obviously interested editors in the North. So through the summer and fall, the major newspapers from around the country sent, of course, their white male reporters down to cover what they called the race war that was brewing in the Carolinas. As you mentioned, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune, just about every major paper from the North sent their reporters down. And they were met at the train station by the white supremacist leadership, and they offered them cigars and whiskey, and they arranged for places to stay. And they just tried something that I thought was very interesting. I mean, today we would call it embedding reporters. They didn't use that term then, but what they did was not assign, but they would send these white reporters out with the red search, patrolling around town, and really feed them the narrative that Black men were stockpiling weapons, and they specifically said in churches, and planning to rise up and riot and take over the city. And that was the story that was told to America. And that was the story Americans came to believe, because all of the Northern white press basically were indoctrinated by the white supremacists. And I think they were quite primed and willing to believe that story. And what was really interesting, I read hundreds and hundreds of news stories from all these newspapers, and I did not find one instance where any of these white reporters actually interviewed a Black person. They just didn't talk to them. It's as if they didn't exist. All they reported was the white narrative about this so-called race riot that was being planned. And so they were there during the election and during the coup on November 10th. But again, this was the narrative that came out even after at least 60 Black men were murdered, and the paper was, the Black newspaper was burned, and more than 2,000 Black citizens were forced to flee the city. And we can talk about that in a little while. But that was the situation with the white press. And of course, Black correspondents from the Black newspapers could not go to Wilmington and without being killed. So there was no counterpoint from the Black press, and the Daily Record was shut down the day before the coup because they saw it coming. And of course, Manley had already fled town, so there was no counter narrative.
So you work for the New York Times now, and I'm going to just take a quick sidestep here, a little side here. And has the Times ever, to your knowledge, come to terms with what they did in this instance or in other instances like this, where they were clearly on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of humanity in their reporting and their coverage?
I don't know that they ever did. I think probably because so many other papers were reporting the same thing. It wasn't just a unique event, a unique set of facts reported by the New York Times. It was the entire press. What's interesting is the News and Observer and the Charlotte Observer, which were two of the leaders of the white supremacy campaign, have apologized in 2006. The News and Observer wrote a very detailed series. I think it was a 10-part series about the events in Wilmington in 1898, and wrote an editorial apologizing for Josephus Daniels' role in those events. So in that case, there was an abject apology and a recognition that they had been a part of the white supremacy campaign. And what's interesting today, the News and Observer is a very liberal, pro-democratic paper. It is not a white supremacist paper in any way.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of the effects of, so we know that at least 60 men were killed. We know that lots of others were injured in one way or another. What happened to the population of Wilmington? And then I know from reading the book, how many folks did leave the city? What happened with them? Where did they go? Did they come back? If so, who came back, and how many came back? And what were the effects of these events on the governmental structure, on democracy, participation, voting, and so forth after the events occurred?
Right. These events were cataclysmic for democracy and for Black life. First of all, as I mentioned, Wilmington was 56% Black in 1898. Today, it's 18% Black. I mean, it immediately became a white supremacist stronghold within weeks of the coup because so many terrorized Black families fled the city. Politically, though, it was even more devastating. Of course, all these Black men were removed from elected and appointed office, but more importantly, they were stripped of the vote through intimidation and fraud. I'll just give you a couple of numbers. In 1896, there were 126,000 Black men registered to vote in North Carolina, 126,000. By 1902, just 4 years after the coup, the number was down to 6,100. So you can see how amazingly effective this was in just terrorizing Black men and stamping out the Black vote. And essentially, Black citizens in Wilmington and in North Carolina did not vote in any significant numbers from 1898 up until the mid-60s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. During that entire period, there was only a fraction of the eligible Black electorate was able to vote, and this was triggered by the events of 1898. And of course, no Black men and later Black women were in public life or in public office. As I mentioned, 3 of the 10 aldermen were Black men, but they were forcibly removed at gunpoint on November 10th, along with the white Republicans and populists. And from that point on until 1972, no Black citizen served on the town council or the board of aldermen in Wilmington. So I mean, that's 70 years that they kept Black people out of public life. Very effective.
Yeah, it's amazing actually how long those effects lasted. So I know the federal government was informed of these events ahead of time. So they were told that, and President McKinley was told, these white men are gathering, they're getting their arms together, they're planning on, overthrowing a government. The governor of North Carolina, who was Republican, also knew about these events, that they were going to happen and how severe they were likely to be. But neither the president or, and his cabinet or the governor of North Carolina did anything to stop these events from happening. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what happened, why they didn't choose to intervene, especially given North Carolina Republican governor should have been on on the other side of all this stuff. So why didn't they intervene?
Really, that was one of the most intriguing things that I came across during this book. McKinley had been a Union soldier. He was an abolitionist. And in fact, Black votes were very important in electing him to the presidency. He was the first presidential candidate to appear before a predominantly Black crowd during a campaign. So it was very surprising that he took this attitude of not wanting to get involved. And as you mentioned, he was warned prior to the coup. During the summer, there were visits by Black ministers, and by the only Black member of Congress in the Senate or the House that time was a man named George Henry White, who was from a district in North Carolina next to Wilmington. And he led these delegations to warn McKinley. He actually got an audience with McKinley more than once to warn him that the white supremacists were openly plotting a coup and they were terrorizing Black men, keeping them from voting. And he asked McKinley to send federal troops down to preserve the vote. And McKinley just refused. And as you mentioned, after the coup, these same George Henry White, the congressman, and Black ministers made the same appeals to McKinley, but he refused. Now, the coup was discussed in cabinet meetings in the days after November 10th, but there was I could find no record anywhere that McKinley ever made any public comment about the coup or about whether he would react or not react to it. Governor Russell, as you mentioned, was a Republican, the governor of North Carolina. He was actually from Wilmington, and he was part of the planter elite. His family had been planters and slaveholders, and he knew he was related to and very, very close and friendly with the white supremacists, but they intimidated him and threatened him, and he was cowed, and he didn't dare call out or ask the president to send federal troops, because he had been threatened not only with removal from office, but with assassination. So this whole series of circumstances really, I think, forced McKinley to decide that he just wasn't going to get involved. I think he was looking ahead to the election in 1900, and he needed the South, he needed white votes, and I think he made a very cold calculation. Well, the black vote has now been eliminated in North Carolina, and because these events of 1898 inspired other white supremacists through the South to crack down on the black vote. I think he realized that he wouldn't be able to rely on the black vote and that he would need the white vote. That's speculation, but I've really struggled with what his motivation and reasoning was. But in any case, he did not do anything, and he made no public comment about it.
So I know these events had repercussions throughout the South. Other towns and cities saw what happened in Wilmington, saw how "quote unquote" successful the whites were in forcing out Black Americans and so on. So can you tell us about what other towns, what were some of the other towns that did take action because of what happened in Wilmington to further their own white supremacist goals in their towns and in their cities? And were there any that were anywhere near as violent as what happened in Wilmington?
No, I mean, there was no repeat of what happened in Wilmington, but just for one example, in Georgia, in I believe it was 1902, there was the race for governor, and they came up with a similar plan to intimidate and murder Black men to keep them from voting. But up in the run-up to the election, they sent a delegation to consult with the leaders in Wilmington to just get instructions on how they pulled it off. So, I mean, that's just one example of how this event inspired others. But essentially, they proved that you could use violence, intimidation, and even murder and not be held to account, because no one was ever held accountable for any of the murders, for the coup, for the intimidation, for the terror campaign, and nothing. No one was ever prosecuted, much less sent to the jail. So the message was, you can push as far as you want, you can be as violent as you want, you can even kill Black people, and you will not be punished. And that message came through loud and clear. And the vigilantism and the intimidation and even the murders, the lynchings rose, that just spread throughout the South. The other thing that was interesting after Wilmington was the Jim Crow laws that were immediately passed, because in North Carolina, they had stolen the election and taken over the legislature. One of the first things they did was starting to formalize the practice of Jim Crow, which had been in place, but they established it in law. And I believe the first Jim Crow law in North Carolina, the actual law, was in Wilmington, segregating the trains. And it just spread from there to hospitals and schools and cemeteries and on and on. So that was really the beginning of legalized Jim Crow. And finally, without getting, this is a little political, but the legislature, now run by white supremacists, used a model in Louisiana called the grandfather clause that was especially effective in keeping Black men from voting. This law stated that if you or your father or grandfather or male relative voted in an election in North Carolina before 1867, you were not subject to a literacy test or a poll tax, were two measures that were used to prevent Black men from voting. So there were, as I mentioned, a lot of illiterate whites, almost 25%, and there were a lot of poor whites. So this cleared poor whites, illiterate whites to vote, but at the same time, it completely eliminated every Black man, because Black men did not get the vote until 1868 in North Carolina. So it was a blatant but legal piece of legislation that eliminated Black men from voting legally. And other states followed. I think 4 or 5 other states by 1900 had also passed so-called grandfather clauses. which weren't overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court until 1915. And by then, the intimidation and oppression of Black voters in North Carolina throughout the South was so, just so deeply in place that it couldn't be dug out until, as I mentioned earlier, until the civil rights movement, the rise of the civil rights movement in the late 50s and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
Well, even after that, as you write about in the epilogue, there still have been efforts to suppress the Black vote in all over the country, but certainly in the South. Different kinds of laws about voter ID and the gerrymandering of districts and things like that. So these efforts that began well before this century, the 19th century, are still happening today, just in a different form.
Yeah, well, you mentioned gerrymandering. That's been used very effectively in North Carolina by the state legislature. It was dominated by Republicans. And actually, it was used in Wilmington prior to 1898. The white supremacists had packed Wilmington's Black population essentially into two precincts to dilute the vote. And they did the same thing just in the last few years, packing Black citizens into these tightly controlled districts and leaving all the other districts free for Republicans. As you mentioned, I go into it in the epilogue, and I don't want to go into too much detail here, but the point is they're using the same tactics as in 1898, along with misinformation and disinformation and the big lie to really to suppress the Black vote. It's been very effective. What's I found very interesting is that obviously the state legislature after the white supremacists took over in 1898 was 100% white. Today, the Republican delegation to the North Carolina General Assembly is 100% white still. And these are the people who are pushing, voter ID and gerrymandering and other measures to tamp down, well, not just the Black vote, but all groups who tend to vote Democratic.
Mm-hmm. So as I was reading through your book, I was thinking about South Africa and thinking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established in South Africa to try to heal the many, many wounds, the very deep wounds caused by apartheid. And then I got to the end of your book and saw that North Carolina, in fact, did establish its own commission that had some similar kinds of goals. This was the year 2000, to investigate the causes of and the consequences of the coup and the massacre in 1898. So can you talk a little about this commission, why they were formed, who got them to start investigating these situations, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, the so-called the Race Riot Commission, the Wilmington Race Riot Commission, was proposed by two African-American state legislators from Wilmington, and it was passed by the General Assembly. And they put together a team of historians and scholars and political leaders to really burrow down into the causes and the effects of what happened in 1898. And they spent 5 years and really did a thorough job and produced a 400 and some page, really thick, detailed report of what happened. And their conclusions were essentially that this was not a race riot. This was a coup. This was a white supremacist massacre of Black voters, that it was a planned, premeditated coup d'etat and a racial massacre. So it sort of set the record straight after more than 100 years of this myth that was promulgated by the white supremacists and kept alive all those years. What was interesting is that report faded pretty quickly, and then I still run into people constantly who've never heard of Wilmington 1898, much less this 2006 report. But I mean, it got quite a bit of attention at the time, and it did have. I mean, there were attempts in Wilmington at reconciliation, mostly led by the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, which gathered together a lot of descendants and tried to get Blacks and white citizens together to discuss what happened and to kind of reconcile. And they were very interesting events. One was 100 years to the day from November 10th, 1898. They assembled African-American choir and a white choir at a church to sing, liberation hymns in the church where the white minister 100 years before had declared, "We have taken a city," and celebrated the coup. But I mean, that was a pretty meaningful event. And there were a lot of events like that. But reconciliation, it's still not been fully achieved in Wilmington to this day.
So the events that you describe in your book obviously occurred over 100 years ago. And I'm wondering about people who read the book or read about the book or hear talks like this one that you give, who are appropriately horrified by the events, but then say, you know what, that was then, this is now. We aren't like that anymore, you know? So have you gotten that kind of pushback or questioning? And how do you respond to people who say things like that to you?
Yeah, I have got a little bit of that, not as much as I thought I would. I think most of the readers of this book tend to be more progressive and more liberal. I'm get the sense that the far right wing and even so-called moderate Republicans just choose to ignore it. I haven't got a lot of pushback from them. But what I do tell people is all you have to do is read the headlines today to see that this is quite relevant. I mean, we're repeating so many things that happened in 1898. I mean, January 6th is the obvious example where you had white nationalists and white supremacists inciting essentially white men to violence. Well, in the case of November 6th, to march on the Capitol and attack police. I found very interesting that in 1898 and on January 6th, that both Trump and Colonel Waddell really equated vigilantism with patriotism, and saying the message was that these other people, these people they were demonizing, basically Black people, essentially, Trump encoded language really targeted Black voters in places like Philadelphia and Atlanta and Milwaukee, identified them as truly un-American. And that was the theme in 1898 as well, is that Black men were not American citizens. They didn't belong, that the true American was a white Christian male. And I really think that was part of Donald Trump's message. He never said it as much, but that was his message, that these are the true Americans, and these other groups are trying to steal your birthright. And we have to, as I believe it was Rudy Giuliani said, you have to fight like hell. It was something about battle tested. Anyway, there were all these allusions to violence and battle, really saying that in defense of your liberty and your patriotism, violence and vigilantism is permitted, and it has been encouraged and is required.
Well, you also find some of these same individuals talking about law and order, you know, and this was one of the pretexts for the coup itself, right? It was we're going to restore law and order to Wilmington because the government is corrupt. All these criminals are out there doing these horrible things to our women. We're planning to do even worse things down the road with this riot. So what we want to do, you know, supposed riot. So what we want to do is we want to impose structure and law and order and return America to what it really should be. And so we saw that then. We saw that in the 1970s with Richard Nixon.
Right.
We've seen that in the 1920s, you know, with Trump and others. And so those same tropes we see again and again, that when we hear the term law and order, most of the time it means we're going to suppress people who aren't white. We're going to make sure they can't vote, they can't participate, and they can't gain power. And there's really this, as you said, there's a model for this from 1898 going forward. We've seen it again and again in one form or another.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially saying this is our country, and we are the true Americans, and these other groups. And it was really in both cases, they really created scapegoats and really played to the fears and resentments and insecurities, basically, of white males in both cases, and incited them to violence by setting up these dangerous people on the other side who are lawless and corrupt, who are stealing the election. What's interesting is in 1897, when the black and white coalition took over the Wilmington government, the immediate reaction from the white supremacists was that the election was stolen and that we were going to get it back. And that was one of the battle cries in 1898, is that they stole the election and this time we're going to steal it. So I just find it interesting, all these parallels that have lasted well over 100 years and are still in effect today, and using the same tools of misinformation and incitement really to play on people's fears and insecurities. And what's really frightening to me is how effective that can be and how easy it is to just tip over that line and descend immediately into violence. I mean, this is getting a little off point, but we saw it in Brazil on Sunday. I mean, sort of the same themes running through. People being incited and being told that there was an injustice and that violence is needed to correct it.
And people believing these claims that which have no evidence, there's no support in the real world for these things. They believe the claims because they fit some kind of a larger mythology or ideology they have about the world, the world's supposed to be.
Yeah, just to show you just how thorough this was in 1898, in response to this constant drumbeat of stories, myths of black men plotting to assemble all these weapons and to murder white men and rape their women. The white supremacist leaders arranged for white families to be evacuated from Wilmington prior to the election out of fear. They believed their own lies, essentially. It's that black men were going to rise up and create a riot and kill white women and children. They believed it to the extent that they did move their families out of the city, which is pretty amazing.
It truly is. So let me turn to some audience questions then. And so one listener is asking, if you've ever spoken at North Carolina or anywhere in the South, did you get any backlash from opening these wounds?
Not openly. I went to a public library in a fairly conservative county down in the southern part of North Carolina. And when I got there, the librarian handed me a note and said, "Oh, someone left this for you." And it had my name on it, and it said something to the effect, "Why are you stirring up all these racial hatreds? Just leave this alone. Signed, a white man." I mean, it's just one example of sort of the extreme reaction I got, but that was really unusual. I didn't get a hold of that, at least not in public. And I made a point of staying off social media, so I don't know what was going on in Twitter and Facebook. There was probably something there, but it didn't come to my attention.
Well, yeah, I see you're still on Twitter, so I was wondering if you had anything, about this on Twitter, because there's so much negativity, as you very well on Twitter now.
Nothing that critical. I mean, there have been comments on the book, but mostly just relating the facts and saying what a surprise it was and how I didn't know about this, but nothing from the right that I'm aware of. Very little.
So you've talked about in the book, and I've seen the other interviews that you've done, about how these events were largely ignored or stunningly misconstrued in North Carolina. The history school textbooks and history, school textbooks and for history classes and so forth. And I think I heard you read a passage or two from one of those in another interview you gave. So I don't know if you have that handy to present to us again tonight. And then if you could talk about, has anything changed to your knowledge in these books about what's being taught to our grade school, children in North Carolina about these events?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I did keep these passages with me to read because they're so shocking. These are passages from North Carolina high school history books talking about the coup. And I should say the coup was barely mentioned in these textbooks. It was basically just covered up for more than 100 years. But when they did talk about it, it's very interesting the way it was framed. I'll just give you some examples here. I'm going to read from a public high school textbook from 1933 talking about the coup. Quote, "There were many Negro office holders, some of whom were poorly fitted for their tasks. This naturally aroused ill feelings between the races." Here's from a textbook from 1940, quote, "The mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, The carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe. This is in a public high school textbook. Here's another one from 1949. Quote, a number of blacks were jailed for starting a riot, and a new white administration took over Wilmington's government. So here you see them buying the complete lie. And finally, this is from a 1940 textbook, and it was a section about the KKK and the red shirts and their role. Quote, to put an end to this terrible condition, white people joined together in a sort of club, which they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members dressed as ghosts and scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened Negroes into living better lives. The names of these men, Negro or white, who had done wrong, were listed. The next moonlit night, the Klan would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold and crime became less and less. So that's just a sense of what school kids were being told about what had really happened in 1898.
And to your knowledge, has that changed? I mean, what are the history books saying now about these events in North Carolina or for any place else for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I searched through the current and recent history textbooks in North Carolina, and it was barely mentioned. And if at all, it was just one line saying there was a race riot, and here's what happened, but with no context, no conclusions drawn, no background. So basically, it's been ignored. Now there is a movement now since this book came out. I've been told by a number of public school teachers that they are trying to get it into the state curriculum, and short of that, even if they're not able to, they intend to try to teach it in their class, essentially without authorization, but to see how far they can get. I don't know where that's gone and how effective it's been, but I do know that it is not officially taught yet. And this issue has really gotten wrapped up into Nicole Hannes-Jones, what's it called?
The 1619 Project?
Yeah, 1619 Project and critical race theory. I'm sorry, I lost that. It's sort of being wrapped up into the whole critical race theory, which the right has used to really try to censor and have been effective in censoring textbooks. And this falls into their complaint that this so-called, and it's not critical race theory, but what they call critical race theory is designed to make white children feel guilty about their race and to focus on race to the extent that that true history is lost. But this subject, and like many others, has gotten wrapped up in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could spend a whole hour or two talking about CRT, and that leads down another rabbit hole. Fascinating topic, troubling topic, and not at all related to what your book is about or how history is being taught in most schools across this country. But that's sort of a side thing. So, in one of our earlier conversations in this series, I spoke with Ty Sedgley and Charles Dew, who are two historians who've written about the South, written about the myth of the lost cause. And how it was, was promulgated to reframe the Civil War as this just and noble cause to restore, prevent northern aggression, and it was about the economy and about freedom and not about slavery. And so I'm wondering how much this myth, which started right after the Civil Wars, had happened, how much of this mythology was part of the effort in Wilmington to create this coup and so on.
Oh, it was a big part of it. As I mentioned, the leading speaker was a former Confederate colonel, and many of the white supremacists had served in the Confederacy. And the red shirts, most of them were too young, but their families had served in the Confederacy. So this was really a driving feature, this retribution and correcting the record and restoring this mythological world that had existed, prior to the Civil War, basically restoring this and going back to those quote values, and very much the same way right-wing Republicans today talk about going back to traditional values. They were just trying to reimpose this world that they believed was virtuous and had been unjustly taken from them by people in the North for the benefit of what became Black citizens. And there's this great resentment towards Black men and the positions that they had attained. And I think this whole lost cause mythology was driving this need to remove Black men from public office and to take the vote away from them and restore them to their previous condition of subservience.
Mhm. So one of our audience members asked about photos. As I'm sure you know, photos were used for postcards or photos of lynchings that were used, put on postcards and sold in the South, sent out in the South through the U.S. Post Office, through the mail. And were there any photos of the events in Wilmington that you're aware of that were used as propaganda and the way that these lynching photos have been used?
Very few. There were almost no photos from that day, but there is one iconic photo, and it's on the cover of the book. And it's the red shirts celebrating after they had burned Alex Manley's paper. They were posing in front of the ruins and celebrating. And that has become very iconic. And you do see that around in a lot of places. I mean, historically framed, but also for propaganda purposes. I mean, it's celebratory. This was years ago, not now. But that photo was used sort of to rally the lost cause myth and to rally the white supremacists over the years who were spreading, the myth of what they say had happened in 1898. But other than that, I came across very few. In fact, no other photos from that day. Now photos of the people involved, yes, but not from that day.
Mhm. Another audience member has asked about the poll tax and how effective was the poll tax in suppressing the Black vote in North Carolina in the late 19th century?
It was very effective. It was one of the major tools along with the literacy test. And that's why the grandfather clause was so important, because it eliminated white voters from having to pay the poll tax. And only Black voters had to pay it because the whites could prove that their grandfather had voted before 1867, and of course Black men couldn't. So it was extremely effective. Many Black men could not afford to pay the poll tax, and even if they could, they would be barred by voting, but by the literacy test or by other means. It was just usually through intimidation and terror. So it was very difficult for them to vote and made it easier for white men to vote.
Mhm. Another listener is asking about she's asking she's asking whether you discovered any other hidden atrocities. So when you were researching this book, did you find things about other cities or towns in the area or in the South that were similarly atrocious, or other sort of hidden, I don't want to use the word gem, but events that people haven't heard about and need to hear about? I mean, did you learn more about the whole South and not just about what happened in Wilmington?
Right. Well, I learned quite a bit about lynching, which was obviously happening throughout the South. A little bit later, I did find some interesting events, excuse me, in South Carolina in the 1870s that really quite similar to what happened in North Carolina. I mean, there was no coup and overthrow of a government, but there were killings, murders of Black men to prevent them from voting, and an organized campaign really to steal elections. They stole several elections and campaigns using red shirts. They called them red shirts. And that's, I think, where the idea for the North Carolina red shirts came from, was South Carolina. But there were a period of years where these organized raids on Black towns and Black population centers and into rural areas, basically intimidating, threatening, and killing Black men to keep them from voting. So this did happen at least once before on a pretty large scale.
Mhm. Another audience member is asking about monuments. And so I'll just read what she's written. So the Confederate monument in Wilmington finally was removed after the Black Lives Matter movement. Is there a monument or at least a marker planned? Or is there are there any museum exhibits in North Carolina or in Wilmington about this series of events?
Yes, as a result of the so-called Race Riot Commission, there was a memorial erected in Wilmington in, I believe, 2008, a fairly major memorial which portrays the events accurately and corrects the historical record, and also memorializes the at least 60 Black men who were known to have been killed. So that is one example of a memorial that has gone up. Just, I think it was 2018, not long ago, there was a marker, a historical marker, put outside the Wilmington Light Infantry headquarters, where the mob met on the morning of the 10th to start the coup. And again, this memorial corrects past markers and gives an accurate and true rendering of what happened in a little bit of context.
Mhm. So another member is asking for you to engage in a bit of counter history. So what if the U.S. government had chosen to intervene, or the North Carolina government had chosen to intervene? Do you think that they would have been successful? And I asked myself the same question. I just wonder that because the forces were so overwhelming, all going in one direction, it wasn't just a small handful of people involved. There were thousands of people involved here, and this movement was happening across the South. And with Reconstruction, it was working for a while, and the U.S. government decided to back out of it, which is why it failed. It didn't fail on its own merits. It failed because the government just stopped backing it and moved the troops from the South. But what do you think would have happened had the U.S. government tried to stop this from happening here in Wilmington?
Wow, that is an intriguing question. I believe if they had sent troops down, they would have been confronted by these white militias and white vigilantes and the red shirts. I think there would probably have been a standoff, and I really think the federal government would have backed down, because the popular will among the whites was so strong. I mean, this was across the state and across the South. And they had gotten this far and been so victorious. I don't believe they would have given any ground. And I really don't think there would have been the political will in the McKinley administration and from the government in Washington to confront the entire South. And in fact, McKinley had made a point during his campaigns leading up to his election of healing the wounds of the Civil War, and speaking to former Confederates and using the Spanish-American War of 1898 as a unifying event to bring the nation back together. So I don't think there was much political will to confront these Southern white supremacists. Even if they had tried, I just don't think it would have been successful.
Thank you for that. Another audience member is asking about what do we take away from these events from 1898 and thereafter, in terms of what's happening around us today? We see white supremacy is again on the rise, becoming more and more out in the open. Even 30 years ago wasn't the case. And there are folks, the Proud Boys and other groups like that, who are essentially saying the same kinds of words that were used back in 1898, maybe slightly softer, maybe slightly harsher in some cases. And so what lessons could we learn from our past about how to confront these things that are happening around us, today?
I think we need to recognize just how effective and poisonous demagogues can be. I mean, when they're given free rein and they aren't confronted, and they're allowed to play on people's fears and hates and prejudices, I think we need to recognize just how close we are at any time to violence. And today, you have a media environment that's completely different than 1898. I mean, with social media, you have got the means to spread lies and to have people create their own universe and their own truths that they believe with all their heart, even if they're false, and can be primed very easily to act on those beliefs with violence, and to be told that violence is patriotic, that if your way of life is threatened, violence is a legitimate tool. I think we need to recognize that, and I believe we are on the edge right now. I mean, this is a really pivotal moment in our history. we'll see what happens with the election coming up in 2024. I don't know if we're going to see this again, but it's very frightening to me.
It certainly is. Certainly is. Another audience member was asking about wondering why this didn't happen sooner. So Reconstruction ended, early 1870s. So there'd already been this increase in power among African Americans in the U.S., especially in the South, that started to turn earlier. But why didn't this happen earlier than 1898? 1885 or 1880, when there was already this big increase in power among Black Americans.
I think it was because there was no other place where it coalesced the way it did in Wilmington, with so many Black men in elected office and appointed office. And I think the success of the Black middle class and the sort of the integration of Black men into public life. Yeah, I mean, it did happen in some respects because after Reconstruction, and towards the end of Reconstruction, was this rise of the KKK and this terror and intimidation and lynching of Black men. But as I said before, I think it didn't happen until 1898 because you had no other examples of Black political and economic power really coalescing in one place to such an extent. And I think the white supremacists really recognized this as a threat and a danger to spread to other areas in the South. And I think that's why it happened when it did.
So we only have a few more minutes left here, and I want to ask you, what is your next project? So now this obviously was a huge effort for you to research this book and to write the book, and now you're doing a lot of talks and presentations on it. And so what are you working on now?
Well, I am looking for another book topic, not necessarily a historical topic. I'm open to anything, and I've been talking to my publisher about ideas, but haven't settled on anything yet. And I have a separate career as a journalist, which keeps me busy as well. But I am looking for something else to write about, some other nonfiction topic whether it's current or historical.
Mm-hmm. We certainly have a lot of experience around the world. You've been a war correspondent in various wars over the years. And is there anything you can tell us about that? I mean, what's it like for you to have been a war correspondent? And you were in Afghanistan, you were in Iraq, you're right there in the front lines. And what was that like for you? And what have you come away? How's it changed you as a person?
Yeah, well, what really draws me to that is writing about human beings. I mean, not about institutions or political events. Throughout my career, I've just made it a point to get on the ground and to try to explain and report on important historical events through the eyes of ordinary people who are directly affected by these cataclysmic events like the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the revolution in Libya, and the war in Chechnya, apartheid, and the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, the civil war and Israeli invasion in Lebanon, and all these events. I think the story is best told through ordinary people. And I've always been fascinated about and surprised by how eager people are to talk to me. I mean, I always say that I'm always meeting people on the worst day of their lives, and that's true. I'm meeting people who are under tremendous pressure, who have just had their lives blown up by cataclysmic events, and yet seem to have this need to want to talk about it and just to have someone listen to them. And I've found that it's very effective to just go up, explain to these people who you are and what you're doing, and then sit back and listen, and you'll find that people really, really want to talk. And I think it's because it's easier to say this to a stranger than to someone you know, and to just really let it out. I find that very rewarding, and I think it's important. You can talk about big forces of history and what's happening at higher levels in politics and government, which are all very important. But I think it's just as important to see out how these policies and facts play out on the ground.
And is there a theme? So you've written 3 books now. Is there a theme that runs through these 3 books or are they just things that came up? You saw these things happening at the time, and you were involved in. Obviously, you were in Baghdad during the Baghdad or around those events happening in Baghdad. But what ties these books together, if anything at all?
I think loosely, they're the stories of people under duress and how people respond under pressure and under danger. In all three of those books, there were stories about human beings and how human beings react to events. You know, whether it's evil characters like the people in Wilmington, the white supremacists, or welfare mothers in Philadelphia trying to survive in sort of drug-infested neighborhoods. It's people under the crush of not historic events, but important events, how they respond, what their motivations are, and how these forces play out on the ground through the lives of ordinary people.
So I have one more question, and I'm a fan of the Ezra Klein show, and Ezra always asks at the end of his interviews for book recommendations. He's asked for 3 on a topic about which they're talking, in the interview, whether it be politics or literature or what have you. So I want to ask you, is there a book or a couple books you'd recommend that readers, that the listeners go out, buy and read, that will teach us more about either the Civil War or post-Civil War, or what's happened in the South since then regarding voter suppression or something along these lines? What might you recommend that the rest of us read to learn more about what's happening down there or happened down there?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a book I'm reading right now is Confidence Man by Maggie Haberman. It's all about one of our favorite demagogues, Donald Trump. So that's actually what I'm reading now. I found the most interesting reading when I was doing the research for this book was newspaper coverage. It was fascinating, and I kept getting distracted because I would just get drawn into a story that had nothing to do about what I was reporting, but was just so fascinating and interesting. And also the way newspaper reporters wrote then was completely different than now. So as far as reading material, there's something called newspapers.com, which is a website, and you can go back a couple hundred years and read newspapers from any period and any part of the country. I mean, that to me would be my kind of recommended reading.
Well, thank you. So I want to thank you again, Dave, for joining us this evening. It's been really fun and interesting to hear your insights and your knowledge of history of these events that we hadn't heard before. And so again, thanks for your time. I want to thank the Mark Twain Library again and the League of Women Voters for their participation, their sponsorship of these events. And I hand the microphone back over to Aaron.
Thank you, Dan.
I just want to thank David and thank Dan for such an enlightening evening discussing these topics that just really are not well known. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who participated tonight, and feel free to check out our YouTube channel. This will be up on it within a few days. So if you missed anything, you can always relive the event. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a wonderful evening.